Hello. How's it going? How you doing? It's me, Chris. I'm by myself again today. Now, the reason I'm by myself, Becca was going to join me. She was getting quite excited. And our little girl took a long time to go to sleep. It happens. It's the perks of it's one of the perks, one of the curses, whatever you want to call it, of being a parent. Our little girl was just having too much fun. And she's nearly 3. Can you tell I'm a tired dad, right? She's nearly 3, and she is a sassy little goober who didn't want to go to sleep, so was watching TV and chatting absolute shit. I came away to record the podcast. I said to Becca, come and join me when you can, and then she texts saying, I can't, I'm too warm. So I imagine she's going to be asleep. Right, I'm recording this on the day it's meant to be out, and it's just been a busy weekend. So like I said, my little girl going to be 3 soon, so we took her to Manchester over the weekend. It was absolutely phenomenal. Ages and ages ago, I booked a Jurassic World experience at the Trafford Centre in Manchester, and the Trafford Centre is an experience I've never been, but none of us had been before. Absolutely huge, complex attraction thing in Manchester in the northwest of England. So Friday night we went to the Manchester Museum, saw an actual T-Rex skeleton, loads of really cool stuff. My little girl absolutely loved it. She was terrified at parts, but that's that's part of having a kid. It's part of having a kid, is that sometimes I just get absolutely fucking terrified. Saturday, took her to the Jurassic World exhibit. It was unbelievable. Life-size dinosaurs. So I'm 31, I'm nearly 32, so I was born in 93, and seeing Jurassic Park as a kid, so when you walk through the gates, I was fucking tearing up. I was just when you get a little lump in your throat, unreal. And then we went to see some fireworks, massive, and honest to God, I said to Becca it was like Bilbo's birthday, the fireworks. It was this huge firework display, and I've never seen anything like it. And I've been to, we saw a firework thing in Hawaii years ago, and you always tend to think Americans do it bigger and better, but fuck me, it was unbelievable. Then Sunday, it doesn't stop there, folks. Sunday, just before we came back, we took her our little girl to the Lego Discovery Centre, where she just got to do a load of Lego stuff. It was a perfect weekend for me, disguised as a weekend for a toddler. Let's put it that way. So, right, you might be here to hear about my family life. You're probably not. You're more likely here to learn about what the episode title is. So today's a big one. Kicking off our next series, which it's been a long time coming. I'm now over 50 episodes in. It's probably time for us to cover him, the titular Lord of the Rings. We're going to cover Sauron, but I don't know what this is, right? I have some kind of, what's the opposite of a delusion of grandeur, where I have this delusion constantly that it won't be that big, it won't be that difficult, it won't be that hard, and then I see everything that's involved in it and I think, what the fuck was I thinking? I thought Sauron was going to be a 1-parter, maybe 2. I'm not quite so sure anymore, because today, spoiler alert, all we're going to cover is his names and his titles. We're going to give a brief description of some of his physical forms, but we're mainly going to be looking at his names and his titles, and that's just how much there is about this cunt. So yeah, I'm not going to say it's going to be a 2-part series, a 3-part series, whatever. I just know it's going to be a series. So the plan, right? Stick with me. The plan is, today, we're going to cover his names and we're going to cover his titles. We're going to talk a little bit about him in general. We're going to talk about some of the cool shit to do with his names and titles. Then, next episode, we're going to start covering him in the First Age. We're going to cover the other versions of him. And then the episode after that, we're going to cover the Second Age, which is going to be a lot of Numenor. So you're going to get a lot of Numenor knowledge there, and Second Age Middle Earth, because he's very closely wrapped up in it. And even now, I'm still learning things I had no clue existed. There is something in this episode that I'll point out when we get there. I read the name and I was like, what the fuck is that? I went digging. It was this entire story set in the Second Age that I had no idea about. I've never, ever come across it before. Never seen any reference to it. Never heard anything. And all it was just a background for one of Sauron's names. So then the episode after that, we're going to go through the Third and the Fourth Age. You know, like, because again, with the planned sequel to Lord of the Rings that Tolkien abandoned, Sauron was possibly going to come back. There was going to be some kind of like cult that was wanting to resurrect him, and that'll be Sauron. And this kind of serves this year as our like spooky type of subject. Now, we missed Halloween just because of the way the episodes fall. Halloween was absolutely fucking fantastic. It was so much fun. But again, it's because I'm a dad, so my fun Halloween is a little bit different. A couple of years ago, before our kid was born, we were throwing parties at our house and just getting absolutely wrecked with our neighbours and being slutty, spooky. And then this year, our little girl wanted to come home because she was scared of the costumes and wanted to give out the sweets rather than get some, which was absolutely heartwarming. But enough about me as a dad. Also pointing out as well, the last episode that was released was a relaxed drunk talk one. Me and Becca watched The Hobbit from 1977, maybe. Fuck knows, I can't remember. I was quite drunk. It was fun. The next one I've got planned for that is the 1978 Lord of the Rings one, which was what I was initially planning. But a lot of you seem to like that. The audio, it was more of like it was an audio commentary as we were watching it, and then kind of just devolved into a slice of life. Taught me and Becca just talking. So people responded very well to that, which is very interesting. So look out for more of those kind of relaxed episodes in future. So that is kind of all the housekeeping I wanted to do. Let's go. No, it's not. Last one. If you are going to be at Tolkien next year in Geldern in Germany, let your boy know. Hit me up. There is a few of us that are planning to meet up there. Friends of the podcast, friends of mine, friends of yours, if you want to come as well. So yeah, let me know if you're going to be there. Me and Becca should be there. Our costumes have started to come. Becca is dressing up as Nienna, the Lady of Grief, the Valar. She's got a lovely grey dress. It's really cool. I'm going to add some stuff to it. Both want to lose a few pounds for our costumes to make sure we be the best we are. And I naturally am going to be a dwarf. I've got a cloak and shit. It's pretty fucking cool. So if you're going to be there, let me know. Hit up your boy, and we can meet up. We can have a drink. We can have a chat. We can talk all things Tolkien, because that's what the weekend's going to be for. And lastly, if you haven't joined the Discord and you want to come and hang out with me and some other like-minded individuals, then please do. There's people from kind of other areas of the Tolkien fandom who are in and who are kind of like around on the internet. So come and join some like-minded individuals. I've been gang pressed into making an anime channel recently because turns out there's actually, like, Becca pointed this out the other day. It's really like basically because Tolkien is the kind of the basis of like modern fantasy. There's so many a lot of us have a lot of interests that overlap, and recently discovered there's obviously quite a lot of weebs who who enjoy like anime and shit. So there's a surprising amount of that talk that goes on, which I was quite surprised at. But anyway, as they used to say on some of the earliest podcasts that I ever listened to, which was the Cracked.com podcast, back before podcasts were kind of big and before I really knew what they were, they always used to start with the show notes, which is what this was, and then they'd say, now on with the show. And yeah, it's weird how far podcasts have come, where it used to be established platforms, and now it's just some cunt sat in his home office talking about Tolkien. So anyway, right. Sauron. That's who we're covering today. Sauron. You know it's going to be a series. Like I've said, I knew it was going to be a series. I tried to lie to myself. That didn't work. So, You know him, you love him. He's the giant flaming eye sitting on top of Barad-dûr in the films. He is the behemoth in armor during the opening sequence of the Fellowship of the Ring, which is fucking amazing. And if you're a Rings of Power fan, he's a very super sexy, rugged Southlander, or he is a twink angel, depending which series you're watching and which particular scene. But you know him. He's a sexy Maiar, comes out with the smoke like he's on fucking Stars in Their Eyes and Rings of Power. The Deceiver. So I remember when I was watching Rings of Power, when he came out of like the smoke and he was looking at Celebrimbor, I was just reminded of Stars in Their Eyes. It was like, tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be Anatar, Lord of Gifts. Anyway, he's the boy all with long hair. He's sexy, he's scary, depending on what day of the week you catch him on. But he's all round, he's a proper cunt. He's a bastard. So this episode, we're going to talk about Sauron, but it's going to be kind of like a soft primer. The movies are the base knowledge, right? That's where we start. As well, we always start is that the movies should be kind of like the base knowledge of Sauron. And you know that he is the main enemy of the Third Age. He is the commander of the enemies. He's the manipulator. He's the deceiver. He is the bad guy. And that's what we're going to cover, some of your attributes. So, because this is a soft primer, I'm going to thumb it in with a softie and going to describe quite loosely some of the various forms before looking at his names. Because with him being a Maiar, Sauron could and used to and did change his shape a lot. So all Maiar were able to go about uncloaked, right? Where they were able to eschew, take off a physical form and wander around freely. And Sauron used to do that, but now you find that the evil ones, the bad ones, they tend to lose this ability at some form or another. So some of Sauron's forms where he could go uncloaked, but he was also very adept at shapeshifting. And in the first age of Middle-earth, we see him being things like a werewolf, a vampire, and a serpent. And this is when he's fighting a giant dog called Huan. But when he takes on the form of Anatar, which is, again, what you'll have seen in Rings of Power and read about if you're versed in Tolkien, he takes on what's described as a fair visage. But there's not a lot. Like Tolkien, quite surprisingly, considering it was like elf-like qualities, I was quite surprised Tolkien didn't go into massive detail about what this hunky twink would look like. So, I don't know, it's called a fair visage, right? And Anatar is when he's trying to trick the elves. So I just kind of imagine as just a more beautiful elf, if that's possible. Just like the bestest of elves is how I imagine Anatar. Then obviously the vampire we covered in our Vampire and Werewolves episode, that they look slightly different to what pop culture would expect. You know, they look more like actual like bats. But after the downfall of Numenor, Sauron completely lost his ability to shapeshift into a fair form. It's not clear whether he was able to do it into like other horrible things. I said things with an F, sorry. Things, for the southerners amongst us. But it says he lost his ability to shapeshift into a fair form. Now, it's interesting, this one. It could have been... Could that hint that it might have been Eru's punishment? Maybe. I probably not. I'm probably just pulling that out of my ass. I think it was more likely that he was only then able to assume the horrible form he would go on to have, because he'd been crushed by an island, he'd been sunk to the bottom of the sea, and it took him ages to gather his strength back into a physical form. So I imagine that's got something to do with it. But as I mentioned, I've mentioned in previous episodes, and I've just alluded to just now, we see it with Morgoth, and I'd venture to say the Balrogs as well, as an extension of this, is that when the Ainur, like the spirits, Maiar or Valar, like Gandalf, Radagast, Saruman, Sauron, Morgoth, Manwë, Tulkas, blah blah, you know the Maiar and the Valar. When these bad ones, right, they tend to expend their essence or power into the physical world. So Morgoth divested most of his essence into Arda itself. And because of that, he lost his ability to to take on a fair form as well. He lost his ability to kind of like interact with the unseen world because he'd poured so much of himself into the seen world. Now, frustratingly with Balrogs, I think I heard this somewhere before, but I cannot source it, so if you can help me out, please do. That Balrogs became trapped in their physical forms because they chose to put all of their power into physical prowess. And that means that when they died, they were destroyed because their essence was bound up in their physical forms. Now, Sauron didn't really do this, but the Balrogs did. But it's just kind of that extension that they lost their ability to shapeshift, to walk about unseen, and to interact with the unseen world in a meaningful way because they put so much of their power into the physical world in order to have physical power. So it's said that from the end of the Second Age onwards, like after the fall of Numenor, Sauron's form was terrible and greater. So it was terrible and great. So it was terrible in the sense of he was terrifying. It said that he was malice and hatred made visible, and that few could endure his eye, which went right down goes right down the path of Morgoth. Because that's exactly what Morgoth did. He eventually was only able to take on twisted forms of hatred and malice, which is exactly the same as Sauron. But it's also said that his stature was great, and it's said that he was greater than a man, though not giant. So maybe what we see in the Jackson films is fairly close to it. Like he's like what, 8, 9, 10 foot tall, something like that. So it might have been something similar. But it's interesting that. He wasn't able to take on fair form anymore and becomes a representation of how he is inside, but he's still absolutely terrifying. Isildur writes about Sauron, and he states that Sauron's hands were black with a deadly burning touch, and that Gil-galad, the Elven King, was killed by the heat of this fiery hand. Now, personally, this is a choose-your-own-adventure moment. It's not described much beyond that. I like to think it was like a WWE kind of like choke slam, where he just picks him up and just, oh, god damn, that man has a family. Just puts him through like a wooden table or something. Or he puts his whole hand over Gil-galad's face and just squeezes until it pops. That's, but choose your own adventure. How do you think Gil-galad died? That involves Sauron's hand. That makes it sound like he shoved it up his arse. I'm just going to leave that there. But when Sauron reforms his body in the Third Age, so remember Isildur and Gil-galad defeat him in combat, and Isildur cuts off his finger to take the One Ring from his hand. So in the Third Age, Gollum describes Sauron as having only 4 fingers on one hand. Now this gives him something directly in common with me, because I've only got 4 fingers on one hand. But mine wasn't from losing the One Ring, mine was from falling off a fence when I was 13. But hey-ho. So apart from having that in common with me, also shows that he spent so long getting his physical form back to what it was, but he couldn't really repair any, like the major damage, like losing a finger. This is interesting. But then we talk about the eye, right? Let's talk about the eye, which is something we all know. Is that so it seems like the eye in the Jackson films, we know it's just a representation of Sauron's malice, whereas in the books he's actually got physical form. We just never see it, right? He's in Barad-dûr giving out orders and what have you. But in the films he's the eye, blah, blah, blah. But in the unseen world, or the spiritual side of things, it seems that Sauron does mainly manifest as this eye. It says that it's his gaze that manifests, and the eye that people see is yellow and rimmed with fire. And it seems like this eye, it's where he exudes a lot of his power from, is that nobody comes away from interacting with Sauron's gaze unscathed. Like Aragorn, Denethor, Gandalf, like they all look and strive with the will of Sauron, and they come away like exhausted and weakened. And that's all I'm going to say about the physical forms and what have you, because interestingly, apart from a lot of like really gay fan art, that's not where his qualities really lie with Sauron. I just wanted to cover that off. we're going to go to his names now. Now, you know how much I love etymology, philology. I love this shit. So I thought I'd get it all out of the way because there's a big fucking chunk of it this episode. Well, this is the episode. That is the episode. It's just how much like names and titles he has. So to us, we call him Sauron, but though he didn't allow that name to be used by his servants. In The Hobbit, he's the necromancer, despite, as I mentioned in the necromancy episode, never doing any necromancy in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. To his dad, he's Mairon, or Myron, and he's a pain in the ass to Middle-earth, and that's Sauron in general, right? And he's Morgoth's bottom bitch with a different approach. So he's also called the captain of Angband and Morgoth's lieutenant or lieutenant to the Americans as well. So let's go balls deep with these names, right? Strap on, buckle in, and get ready to take all this knowledge deep inside yourself. Also, as well, I mentioned we're going to cover him as Tevildo, the Prince of Cats, and Thu, the Necromancer, in the next episode, where we cover the alternate versions of Sauron before he became who he was. Also, to point out as well, for anyone who doesn't know at this point, Sauron predates the universe. That's where his name of Mairon comes from, or Myron, and that's what he might have been called in the beginning when he did serve Aule before he served Morgoth, and that's what he originally was, a servant of Aule the Smith, and his main quality was that he loved order. He loved to order the world and do logistics and shit like that, right? And that's what ultimately led him to Melkor, because Melkor was able to bend things to his will and carry out his plans like quickly. And then you see that it's just a steady descent, and then he becomes the absolute bastard. He becomes the absolute bastard that we know. So, Sauron comes from Quenya and means the abhorred. He hated being called that, wouldn't let his servants use that name. But with Tolkien being Tolkien, there are tons and tons of possible origins of just that word, of where that word comes from in Quenya. And I'll go through the main ones now. So in the first one comes from The Lost Road and Other Writings, which is one of the History of Middle-earth series, where Tolkien suggested it comes from the Quenya Saura, which means foul, putrid, or evil-smelling, which in turn comes from the primitive Quenya word, or the root of the word, Thus. So the word Thus becomes Saura, becomes Sauron. The second one is quite similar, from Quenya Saura again, but this time the root of the primitive Quenya word might have been Sawa, which means disgusting or bad. The third one is one that, interestingly, Tolkien rejected, because he wrote at one point that there is a Sindarin word called Saur, S-A-U-R, which means bad, that Sauron might have come from. And one of Sauron's other names does derive from this, but Tolkien then wrote in the margin something like, has to be Quenya, or and then he wrote a root for the word, and I think it was Thus. So we then have my favourite letter in the world, Thorn, for the next one. So Thorn is it's that rune letter that you see, and it's a very old letter where it's a straight line. It's like a P if the round bit of the P was halfway down the line instead. And it's pronounced th. And we, if you go back and listen to an episode, I think it was the one where Alex was a guest. If you go back and listen to the episode with Alex where we talk about Fëanor, we talked about the shibboleth of Fëanor, and how using the letter Thorn became a symbol of whether you were on the side of Fëanor or you weren't. And some people started to use it as defiance against him because he was a twat. But anyway. So, my favourite letter in the world, Thorn, and this is the Quenya word, Thaurond, which comes from the adjective Thaura, which means detestable. And that comes from the root primitive Quenya word of Thor, T-H-A-W. Then lastly, even though Tolkien said Quenya, he offered a few different versions of it. The word Sauron might have derived from Thauron, the Thauron, which has a root in Sindarin, meaning Thar, Thar, which means abominable or abhorrent. And this is really tricky now because, he said it came from Quenya, but the closest root word is Sindarin, like I've just mentioned. But then another name that Sauron has was given to him by the Sindarin in the First Age, and that is Gorthower, which is, again, so fuck knows. Fuck knows what the concrete origin of the word Sauron is. We just know it's a Quenya word, probably that means evil, abhorrent, disgusting, putrid, blah, blah, blah. And there's no need for us to really dive into primitive Quendian because it's a whole other thing. And it's the earliest language that the elves spoke when they woke up. So let's talk about the other names now. Gorthower is the one I've just mentioned, and that is given to him by the Sindarin in the First Age of Middle-earth, i.e., the Grey Elves, the ones who didn't go to Valinor, who stayed around in the forest with Thingol and Melian. And it means terrible dread. So that comes from Gor, Gor, which is horror or dread, and Thaur, meaning abhorrent, which I've just mentioned. Another version of this name, according to the book The War of the Jewels, was Gorsoth, with the DH for the th sound. And in Quenya, the equivalent of this Sindarin name was Norsus, and that source is the good old magazine we've come across before called the Palmer Elder Lamberon, which I was able to get quite a few copies of on PDF. So yeah, thank you Skilmore on the Discord who helped. I got one copy. I posted it into one of our channels, and he just didn't even fucking say anything. Just started uploading all the versions he had. So GG. It's also said, as I mentioned earlier, Sauron's original name was Mairon, Mairon. Now, this is interesting because Tolkien wrote that as a note in like the 50s, and it's not super expanded on, but this makes me laugh. We're going to come to some shit that just makes me laugh because it's so fucking silly. Mairon means the Admirable in Quenya, but he lost this name when he began to serve Morgoth and his evil, and people stopped referring to him as Mairon. But funnily enough, he would still call himself Mairon the Admirable. Like, there's going to be a few instances of this. So if you translated it all, he's just calling himself the Admirable, which is just like, so there's a baseball team, right, in America called the Los Angeles Angels, which if you translate that is the Angels. And then another silly occurrence like this is when people refer to, like, the Italian mafia, right? They call it the La Cosa Nostra, which would in English would be this thing of ours. So just a quick etymology. Mafia is something I'm quite interested in. I've read quite a lot of books about. It's not called La Cosa Nostra, and it's not called the Cosa Nostra. It's just called Cosa Nostra, which means this thing of ours. So even putting La is this thing of ours. And then the La Cosa Nostra, the this thing of ours. It's just like, what even are words? Fuck me. It makes me laugh, right? So all the way up to the fall of Numenor, though, Sauron called himself Tar Mairon, which means King Excellent or King Admirable. And he called himself that all the way until after the downfall of Numenor, but he never used that name while he was on Numenor. The reason for that was the kings of Numenor would call themselves Tar, and then, Tar whatever, and then later Ar. So Ar-Pharazôn, later on, and then before that was Tar. So Tar had royal implications. Yeah. So while he was there, though, interestingly enough, just like some other Maiar we know that visited Middle-earth and what have you, he was called Zigur, which in Adunaic, which is the language of Numenor, means wizard. Which, remember, wizard, in Tolkien's writing, doesn't mean magic user, it means wise person. So he was called Zigur, which means wizard. And yeah, he was the wise man for Ar-Pharazôn, he was the advisor to whilst he was there. And Adunaic as the last one, that is the language that the Westron. So Westron is the common language of Middle Earth that everyone speaks in the Third Age. So when we're watching the films or reading the books and they're speaking like what we think of as English, they're speaking Westron, which is derived from Adunaic, with the Numenorian language. And interestingly enough, the Numenorians were able, when they came over again to Middle Earth in the Second Age, they were still able to find common words and phrases with a lot of people on the mainland, because their languages were still quite similar, because it all came from like the folk of Haleth, like their languages. Anyway, I'm getting distracted, right? Another name you might be familiar with, again, the Rings of Power, is Anatar, which means Lord of Gifts in Quenya. Anyone who's recently watched Rot will be familiar with that, blah, blah, blah. And again, Anatar, fucking hell. Right. Anatar means Lord of Gifts. That's what it means. So Tar, king, lord, right? Anna, gifts. To call him Anatar, Lord of Gifts, is to call him the Lord of Gifts, the Lord of Gifts, twice. Like, is this a joke? Is Tolkien, is he doing a funny on us, or are we being silly? I also found 2 other names that he used in the Second Age, but these were quite specific in relation to trying to deceive the elves. That sneaky little bumhole. Tell you what, you can't never trust a blonde-haired twink. Let me tell you that one for free. Never trust a blonde-haired twink. I don't know he's blonde, but I'm assuming he was. Elves seem like they'd appreciate blonde. Although the Noldor might have been black-haired. Anyway, don't trust twinks. Let's just keep it general. Don't trust twinks. So, 2 names he used with the elves. Aulendil was the first one. And this means one who is devoted to Aule, the smith, the smith of the Valar. And I imagine Celebrimbor would have fucking ate this shit up, being the grandson of Fëanor. But interestingly, in a note that reveals this, Tolkien says that Galadriel wasn't taken in by this. So when Anatar, or Sauron, introduced himself as Aulendil, she was like, absolutely no fucking way does this guy serve the Aule in Valinor. But then, I'm not sure who I respect more for this. Tolkien as the writer, or Sauron as the liar, as a creation of Tolkien's. Because Tolkien writes in a little subnote here that this is technically, like, Sauron still technically could be telling the truth, and it's more of a manipulation. It's like a lie by omission, because Tolkien says this is not decisive, since Aule existed before the building of Arda, and the probability that Sauron was in fact one of the Aulean Maiar, corrupted before Arda began by Melkor, right? So what we mean there is that he could say, I am Aulendil, I am one of Aule, I'm a Maiar of Aule. Galadriel says, well, you don't serve Aule in Valinor, and he'd be like, well, I never said I did. He existed a long time before fucking Valinor did. So yeah, it's I mean, obviously, ultimately, it's Tolkien being the sneaky bumhole here, but like, I thought, that's a very good way of being a manipulator and a deceiver. That he's technically, it's like when they say in The Exorcist, like, mixing a bit of truth in with the lie makes it more effective. But yeah, that's just me being impressed. The other name that he used amongst the elves was Artano, or Artano, which means High Smith. Now, I found a little bit of just a little ball tickler, just a little nipple tweaker that got me interested here, right? Because quite by accident, as I was searching through my PDF versions of Peoples of Middle Earth, I think it was, I was looking for Artano, and I searched ARTA, and I thought that'll get me what I want to. And the bit just before this was very interesting, because Sauron calls himself Artano, which means High Smith. And then Rings of Power has got that stupid fucking Galadriel and Sauron fuck eyes kind of want to ride each other for a bit kind of thing, right? But there's the littlest connection here, because Galadriel's dad, Finarfin, gave her the name Artanis, which means high or noble woman. So it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. I was like, oh my fucking god. So Galadriel, by her the name her dad gave her, was Artanis, which means high or noble woman, and Sauron calls himself Artano, which means like I assume means like it means high smith. So all of those people who want to see Galadriel fuck, I guess that's a little bit for you to hang your nipples on. It's just it was just like, oh my god, couldn't believe it. But love wins because Galadriel chose the name herself after her husband Celeborn gave it. He used to call her that. So she chose that name out of love for him. So phew. Anyway, moving on. 2 other names we'll cover in due course, as I mentioned, is Thu, the Necromancer, and Tavildor, Prince of Cats. They're both very early versions of Sauron from the First Age of Middle-earth, and they're in various forms before he settled into what we know him as. Now that's us done with the names. And so for the last part of the episode, I'm going to go through a big list of titles and epithets which were given by others and himself and were used throughout the ages. And the first one involves a little bit of a tangent of a story that kind of blew my mind. And I mentioned earlier, this is a story set in the Second Age that Tolkien scribbled on like a folded bit of paper, I think, that Christopher found. And it just kind of, the implications was just a bit like, so I went on a bit of a rabbit hole researching it, right? So one of Sauron's titles was the North King. And this relates to a story that, just as a disclaimer, Tolkien, I make no claims that this was ever part of Tolkien's canon, quote unquote, because canon's a very tricky thing with Tolkien, quote unquote canon Middle-earth, because Tolkien admitted that it might have had problems with the connection to Middle-earth, but it does kind of refer to the Númenóreans. So anyway, right. So in the Second Age, the story goes that there was these people who lived in a town called Agar, or they lived in a place called Agar, which was a small town somewhere in Middle-earth, which was relatively close to the western coastline, and it was probably between the mouth of the Anduin and the area of Anfalas, or Langstrand, which is around the southwest of Gondor, right? And the reason I'm being vague for this is because the story is called Tal Elmar, and it's from the point of view of middlemen in the Second Age of Middle-earth. And it details a lad called Tal Elmar who sees the ships of the Númenóreans coming from over the sea. But it's not the joyous kind of, oh, wow, they're coming kind of Númenórean ships. This is going to be like late Second Age, where it's a sight of dread. And what happens is Tal Elmar tells the town master that they're coming, and he doesn't believe him. And they go up to the hill, and by this point the ships have passed out of sight, and they're still coming, but they're far enough away that he's got good eyesight and he can see them, and they pass like beneath a hill, so he can't see them anymore. And as punishment, the master makes him scout out these Númenóreans. As punishment, he basically sends him off on a journey because he doesn't believe him, and he sends him off on a journey. Tal Elmar gets kidnapped. He gets captured and interrogated by the Númenóreans, who he can speak to them because of a dream he's had or something. But that might be that connection to being able to speak elements of each other's language. And they end the story by saying that they plan to basically capture and enslave his people, that they've come now as colonizers. But the bit where Sauron comes into this is one of the characters is Tal Elmar's dad, who is called Khazad Longbeard, and he has 2 prides. One is that he's got 17 sons, and the second is that he's got a 5-foot long beard. It's not really important to the episode. I just thought it was interesting that sounds like my final transformation. Like, he fucks and he grows his beard. That just sounds ideal. But getting back to Sauron, right? So Khazad Longbeard's dad was called Buldar. So Tal Elmar's grandfather was called Buldar, and he had been in the army of the North King. And through a series of rabbit holes, there is then you finally get to the end where there's some reference that dark are the days of the king and the Dark King, and that Sauron is this Dark King, that he is the North King. So it's just, I could not fucking believe that there was this whole story tucked away that I've never heard of, and I don't think I'd have found it unless I was looking for this specific thing, and it just kind of blew my mind. Like, of course, there'll be people who've heard it and be like, "Oh well, Chris, you silly cunt," blah, blah, blah. Whatever. But it does highlight two things for me. The first is that it highlights just how extensive Sauron's history is, that we see the big highlights because of the stories. But if I have to go on a rabbit hole and then look in footnotes and chase it down to see that at one point he was a king with a kingdom and an army that was marshaled to go and fight a battle, it's just to give like the fucking depth to this guy. And the second thing it highlights is just how long these ages of Middle-earth are. We talk about the first age, second age, and third age, and even sometimes talk about the fourth age. And we skip through a lot of them because these are fictional histories, aren't they? But this really does highlight just how long these years are. That kingdoms can, and you just think of our world, of how quickly kingdoms rise and fall in the scheme of things, grand scheme of things, and then to have someone like Sauron who is there all the time in one form or another, and you can't get rid of him. That gives true depth to the guy that we're dealing with. Right, that was the main big one. That was the interesting one. Let's zap through some titles. He was called the Base Master of Treachery. Now, apart from being a fantastic rap name, that was what he was called by Gandalf when he was explaining why they shouldn't trust the mouth of Sauron. Gollum calls him the Black Hand twice. Now, I think that's something that's then picked up on and expanded in the game Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War. Obviously non-canon, but there is like the Black Hand that you fight in there. And then also Gollum calls him the Black One. So, the elements of that there. When Isildur is cursing the Oathbreakers who wouldn't fight with him, he calls Sauron the Black Master, which probably the best porn name, except for one more that I'd like to talk about. He gets called the Dark Lord by many people. Gandalf at one point calls him the Dark Power. He's called the Deceiver by Amandil, who is father of Elendil, who is father of Isildur and an Aryan. So it's Isildur's granddad. And he calls Sauron the Deceiver before Amandil sets out to try and visit Valinor to ask the Valar for help against Sauron for Numenor. And it's interesting to note that this is a quite a heartbreaking story, because he sets out with 3 servants on a boat and he heads west, but he's never seen again. And it's probably that he failed in his mission, because mortals were not meant to go west. Rarely ever. I think Erendil might be one of the only exceptions. Well, actually, Ar-Pharazôn and his army do make it west, but not for long. Not for long. But obviously, at this point in history, the Valar did not want really anything to do with the Númenóreans, because they were being bastards at this point, and didn't seem to help that Amandil was one of the faithful who worshipped the Valar, or well, respected and loved them. Anyway, another thing he's called is the Enemy. That's standard. We know that a lot. He gets called the Great Sauron. Now, this is used by 3 people, and 2 of them will surprise you. Check out more lists on BuzzFeed. So he's called the Great Sauron, but only 3 people call him this. Gandalf, Glowin, and the Mouth of Sauron. Now, the Mouth of Sauron I can understand. Although, can I? Because he doesn't let his servants call him Sauron. So it's like if I had a servant, like if I had a butler, I wouldn't be very pleased if he answered the door and said, "The fat cunt will see you now." Like, I'd probably be having words with him. Like, can you just? I've told you not to call me that, not to company. But yeah, it's interesting that the Great Sauron, fucking glowing. Wow. He gets called the Eye, which mainly refers to how he appears mentally, but it's also his emblem. The orcs refer to him as this a lot, I think. These next ones are great, right? See if you can keep up. He calls himself the King of Kings, mainly used to piss off the Númenóreans. He calls himself the King of Men, mainly used to piss off Númenóreans. He calls himself the Lord of the Earth. It's mainly used to piss off Númenóreans. He calls himself the Lord of the World, which is mainly used to piss off Númenóreans. All to great effect, because he gets what he wants. He gets what he wants with that. He gets called the Lord of Barad-dûr, which is his house. Standard. I think we should normalise being called the Lord or Lady of our own house again. Let's not reserve that for the aristocracy. He gets called the Lord of the Rings. Now, little known fact is that this is actually referring to the harem of twinks that he keeps in Barad-dûr, and they get like little hormone injections to keep the bottoms nice and plump, and that's why he's called the Lord of the Rings. It's actually got fuck all to do with jewellery. It gets called the Nameless, and this is probably used in Gondor because there's also the Nameless Enemy that he gets called by Boromir, and the Nameless One that he gets called by Faramir. So the clues there are that the Nameless is what people in Gondor call him. The last few are, he gets called the Necromancer, standard, although I would now, and hopefully you will, take issue with this. He gets called the One Enemy. I think he's only referred to this once by Frodo, which, interesting. He gets called the Ringmaker. Fair enough. The Ruler. The Shadow. The Sorcerer. And when he's got his fursuit on, Wolf Sauron. Fuck me. That is the epithets and the titles done, I think. I might have missed something. I have no idea. Then I've got the next episode written out, and I was going to move on to it, but that's a lot to take in for an episode, I think, especially when it's just me talking. Like, there's a certain degree of, not padding, but there's a certain degree of back and forth when it's me and Becca. But nearly 50 minutes of me just talking about Sauron is I think that's a lot to digest. So that's it. That's the primer. So you know his names, you know a bit about him, you know where he started, you know where he came from, you know where he goes, you know where he comes from, Cotton Eye Joe. So what we're going to cover next time is we're going to start with the Valaquenta, which is the beginning part of the Silmarillion, and we're going to look at Sauron in the First Age. We're going to look at when he was Tavildor, Prince of Cats, when the story was quite different during Beren and Luthien. We're going to look at Thu as the Necromancer, and then we're going to look at Sauron in the First Age, where he's doing shit in the First Age. Like, he's fighting fucking Finrod. He's taking Minas Tirith, the first Minas Tirith, from Orodreth. Like, that guy is about, like, he's corrupting the forests of I can't remember what it's called. He's corrupting the forest where the vampires are going to live. So yeah, he's getting about. But that brings us to the end for today. I hope you have enjoyed it. And as always, let me know if there's anything you want to hear more of. But that is it from me, Chris. And I will catch you soon. Bye.